Sometimes the things we ignore the longest are the ones that need our attention the most. Frank Mallory had convinced himself that the small wound on his leg was just part of getting older. For 11 years, the 68-year-old widower wrapped it up and pushed through the pain. He lived alone in the farmhouse where he and his wife Martha had built their life together. When the ache finally became too much to bear, he walked into the local clinic. The nurse who examined him was Sarah, Martha's niece. She took one look at the wound and her face went pale. What she found would force Frank to face a truth he'd been avoiding for over a decade. But what had really been causing that wound to never heal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of the old farmhouse, casting long shadows across the scarred wooden table where Frank Mallory sat with his cup of black coffee. The same chair, the same routine, the same silence that had defined his mornings for the past 3 years since Martha passed. He touched the thin gold chain around his neck, feeling the weight of her wedding ring that now hung beside his dog tags, two symbols of the most important parts of his life that were no longer with him. The house felt too big and too quiet. Martha's coffee cup still sat in the cabinet, her reading glasses on the windowsill above the sink, her apron hanging on the hook by the stove. Frank had tried to move these things once, about 6 months after the funeral, but his hands had frozen, halfway to the donation box. Some mornings, he still caught himself setting 2 cups on the counter before remembering outside. The October wind rattled the loose boards on the porch that he kept meaning to fix. Martha's garden had gone wild, the neat rows of tomatoes and beans now overtaken by weeds and volunteer sunflowers that had sprouted from seeds the birds had scattered. She would have been horrified to see it in such a state. Martha had spent 43 years turning this piece of Iowa farmland into something beautiful, and Frank had let it all slip away in just 3 seasons. He shifted in his chair and felt the familiar throb in his right leg, just above the ankle. The wound was acting up again this morning, a persistent ache that had become as much a part of his routine as his morning coffee. Frank rolled up his pant leg and peeled back the edge of the bandage he'd applied the night before. The skin around the cut looked angry and red, the wound itself a stubborn line that refused to close completely despite 11 years of his amateur doctoring. It had started as nothing more than a scratch when he'd caught his leg on a piece of jagged metal while working underneath the old John Deere tractor. Martha had fussed over it, wanting to take him to Dr. Patterson in town, but Frank had waved her off. He was a machinist. He knew how to handle a cut. Some antiseptic, a bandage, and time would take care of it. That was how Frank Mallory had always handled everything, with his own 2 hands and a healthy dose of stubbornness. But Martha had been gone for 3 years now, and the wound was still there. Some days it barely bothered him, just a tender spot he was careful not to bump. Other days, like today, it throbbed with a deep ache that seemed to run all the way up to his hip. He developed a slight limp, favoring his left leg when the pain got bad, but he told himself it was just age catching up with him. At 68, a man had to expect some wear and tear. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. Frank glanced at the clock. 7:30 in the morning was early for a call, but it was probably Tom Henderson from the next farm over. Tom had been checking on him more frequently since Martha died, stopping by with homemade bread from his wife, or finding excuses to borrow tools that Frank suspected he didn't really need. "Frank, it's Betty Henderson. I hope I didn't wake you." "No, I've been up for an hour. What can I do for you, Betty?" "Well, Tom noticed you hadn't collected your mail in a few days, and we were just wondering if everything was all right. You know how we worry." Frank looked through the kitchen window toward the mailbox at the end of his long driveway. She was right. He couldn't remember the last time he'd made the walk down there. The leg had been bothering him more than usual, and the quarter-mile trek to the road and back seemed more daunting each day. "I'm fine, Betty. Just been busy with some projects around here." "Of course you have. Listen, Sarah Williams is coming to visit her parents this weekend. You remember Sarah, Martha's niece? She's a nurse up in Des Moines now. Maybe she could stop by and say hello?" Frank's grip tightened on the phone. He remembered Sarah as a gangly teenager with Martha's kind eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She'd spent summers here as a child, following Martha around the garden and learning to can vegetables in the kitchen that now felt so empty. But that had been 15 years ago, maybe more. "That's not necessary, Betty. I'm doing just fine." "I know you are, Frank, but Martha would want us to look out for you, and you know it. Sarah's good people, takes after her aunt in all the best ways." After he hung up the phone, Frank sat in the growing warmth of the morning sun and thought about Martha's garden tools, still hanging in the shed where she'd left them. The handles were probably getting weathered by now, the metal showing rust from 3 Iowa winters without proper care. She'd been so particular about cleaning and oiling them each fall, wrapping the handles in cloth and arranging them just so on their designated hooks. Frank had been meaning to take care of those tools, along with a dozen other tasks that Martha had always handled. The gutters needed cleaning, the storm windows should have been up weeks ago, and somewhere in the basement, boxes of Martha's belongings waited for him to sort through them. But each time he started one of these projects, he'd find himself stopping, overwhelmed by the weight of her absence and the magnitude of maintaining a life that had always been built for 2 people. He'd worked as a machinist for 37 years, retired with a decent pension and hands that could still fix most anything mechanical. Frank Mallory had never been the type to ask for help or admit when something was beyond his capabilities. During his 2 tours in Vietnam, he'd earned a Purple Heart and a reputation for being the soldier who could jury-rig any broken equipment and get wounded men back on their feet. When he'd returned home and married Martha, he'd applied that same self-reliant attitude to building their life together. But machines were different from people, and wounds on metal were different from wounds on flesh. A tractor could wait for repairs indefinitely, but Frank was beginning to understand that his body operated on a different timeline. The ache in his leg had been gradually worsening, and last night he barely slept for the throbbing pain that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. He stood up slowly, testing his weight on the injured leg, and walked to the kitchen window. The Henderson farm was visible across the section road, their barn a cheerful red against the autumn landscape. Tom was already out in his fields, probably checking on his cattle before the day got too warm. Frank envied his neighbor's easy routine, the way Tom moved through his days with purpose and energy. Frank's days had become a series of small negotiations with discomfort, adjustments and accommodations that he told himself were temporary. In the distance, a school bus rumbled down the county road, yellow against the brown corn stubble of harvested fields. Martha had always loved this time of year, when the hard work of summer gave way to the contemplative season of autumn. She'd spend hours planning next year's garden, studying seed catalogs and making notes in the margins about which varieties had performed well and which needed improvement. Frank limped to the kitchen table and picked up the letter that had been sitting there for 2 days, a notice from the county about property tax assessments. The kind of administrative detail that Martha had always handled with quiet efficiency. She'd had a system for everything. Bills in one folder, insurance papers in another, medical records in a third. After she died, Frank had tried to maintain her organizational methods, but gradually the papers had begun to pile up in disorganized stacks that overwhelmed him whenever he tried to tackle them. The wound on his leg gave another sharp throb, and Frank found himself wondering what Martha would have said about his stubborn refusal to see a doctor. She'd always been the practical one, the voice of reason when his pride threatened to override his common sense. "Frank Mallory," she would have said in that tone that was equal parts exasperation and affection. You wouldn't let a machine run for 11 years with a broken part. Why are you treating yourself worse than you'd treat a piece of equipment?" He smiled despite himself, hearing her voice so clearly in the empty kitchen. Martha had always been able to cut through his nonsense with a few well-chosen words and that look that said she loved him despite his considerable capacity for foolishness. She'd been the one to convince him to see a doctor when he'd hurt his back moving hay bales in 1987. She'd made the appointment, driven him to the clinic, and sat in the waiting room reading a magazine while he submitted to an examination that revealed nothing more serious than a pulled muscle and wounded pride. But Martha wasn't here now to make appointments or drive him to town or sit patiently while he argued with medical professionals about the necessity of their interventions. Frank was on his own with his stubbornness and his pain, and a wound that had been trying to tell him something for 11 long years. The sun was fully up now, painting the kitchen walls with warm yellow light that reminded him of summer mornings, when Martha would stand at the stove making pancakes, humming quietly to herself while the coffee percolated and the house filled with the promise of another day together. Frank touched Martha's ring again, feeling the smooth gold warm against his fingers, and made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Maybe it was time to stop ignoring what needed attention most. The decision to see a doctor might have felt inevitable in the warm light of his kitchen, but 3 days later, Frank had managed to convince himself it could wait until spring. The pain had subsided to its usual dull ache, and he'd found a new way to wrap the wound that seemed to provide better support. He was standing in his workshop, consulting the oil-stained manual for his 1987 John Deere, when the pain shot through his leg like lightning. Frank had been leaning over the tractor's engine compartment, trying to reach a stubborn bolt that had been giving him trouble for weeks. The manual, its pages yellowed and soft from decades of use, lay open on the workbench beside him. He'd always prided himself on being able to fix anything mechanical with the right tools and enough patience. The tractor manual had been his Bible for 15 years, its margins filled with Martha's neat handwriting notes about oil changes and part numbers, reminders about seasonal maintenance. The bolt finally gave way, but as Frank straightened up, his injured leg buckled beneath him. He grabbed for the tractor's hood to steady himself, but his momentum carried him sideways, and he went down hard on the concrete floor of the workshop. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, radiating from his leg up through his entire body like fire through dry kindling. For several minutes, Frank lay still on the cold concrete, waiting for the waves of pain to subside enough for him to think clearly. Above him, dust motes danced in the afternoon light streaming through the workshop's grimy windows. He could smell the familiar mixture of motor oil and rust that had permeated this space for decades. But now these comfortable scents were overlaid with something sharper, his own fear. When he finally managed to sit up, Frank's hands were shaking. The bandage on his leg had come loose in the fall, and for the first time in years, he got a clear look at the wound without any covering. What he saw made his stomach clench with worry. The skin around the cut was an angry purple-red color, and the wound itself seemed deeper than he remembered, its edges puffy and inflamed. There was a smell, too faint but unmistakable, that reminded him of something rotten. Frank had seen wounds like this before, during his time in Vietnam. Infections that had been ignored too long, cuts that had turned dangerous because of pride, or stubbornness, or simple bad luck. He'd watched good soldiers lose limbs because they'd convinced themselves that a small wound would heal on its own, given enough time and willpower. Using the workbench for support, Frank pulled himself to his feet. His leg felt weak and unstable, as if the bone itself had been compromised. Each step sent fresh waves of pain through his body, and by the time he made it to the house, he was breathing hard and sweating despite the cool October air. In the bathroom, Frank cleaned the wound as best he could and applied a fresh bandage, but his hands were clumsy with pain and worry. The antiseptic stung fiercely, and he had to grip the edge of the sink to keep from crying out. When he was finished, he sat on the edge of the bathtub and forced himself to confront a truth he'd been avoiding for 11 years. This was beyond his ability to fix. The Mellow County Health Clinic was a low, brick building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a parking lot that had seen better days. Frank sat in his truck for 10 minutes before working up the courage to go inside, arguing with himself about whether this was really necessary. Maybe the fall had just aggravated an otherwise manageable situation. Maybe a few days of rest and proper care would set things right again. But as he shifted in the driver's seat, the pain flared again, and Frank knew he was fooling himself. Martha had always said that wisdom was knowing when you were in over your head. And right now, Frank was drowning. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and old magazines. Frank filled out paperwork with hands that still trembled slightly, struggling to remember details about his medical history that Martha had always kept track of. When had he last had a tetanus shot? What medications was he taking? Did he have any allergies? The questions seemed designed to highlight how little attention he'd paid to his own body over the years. Frank Mallory? He looked up to see a young woman in scrubs standing in the doorway, clipboard in hand. For a moment, his heart stopped. She had Martha's eyes, the same warm brown color, the same gentle expression that could see straight through to a person's soul. But this woman was younger, with sandy blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail and a professional bearing that spoke of years of medical training. Sarah? Frank's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. Uncle Frank. Her smile was genuine, tinged with surprise and something that might have been relief. I heard you might be coming in. How are you holding up? Sarah Williams had been 14 the last time Frank had seen her. All knees and elbows and fierce determination to prove she could do anything the adults could do. She'd followed Martha around that final summer like a devoted apprentice, learning to can peaches and tend the vegetable garden with the same methodical care that Martha brought to everything she touched. Now Sarah was 29, a registered nurse with steady hands and her aunt's gift for making people feel both cared for and slightly transparent. She led Frank to an examination room, chatting easily about her parents and her work at the hospital in Des Moines. But Frank could see her professional assessment happening behind a casual conversation. She was noticing his limp, the way he favored his left leg, the careful way he lowered himself onto the examination table. "So what brings you in today?" Sarah asked, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. Frank hesitated. Now that he was here, in the bright fluorescent light of the examination room, his stubbornness reasserted itself. "Just a small cut that's been giving me some trouble. Nothing serious." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "How long has this cut been bothering you?" "Oh, not long. Few months, maybe." "Frank." Sarah's voice carried a note of gentle authority that reminded him powerfully of Martha. "I'm going to need you to roll up your pant leg so I can take a look." When Frank peeled back the bandage, Sarah's professional composure slipped for just a moment. Her face went pale, and she leaned closer, her expression shifting from routine concern to alarm. "Frank, how long have you really had this wound?" The question hung in the air between them, and Frank found himself unable to maintain the fiction he'd been telling himself for over a decade. 11 years, he admitted quietly. Sarah's hand stilled over the wound, and when she looked up at him, Frank saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten with shame. It was the same look Martha used to get when she was disappointed in him, not angry, just sad that he'd chosen the hard way when an easier path had been available all along. "Uncle Frank," Sarah said softly, "this isn't just a cut anymore. This is a chronic wound, and from what I can see, it's infected. We need to get Dr. Henley in here right away." As Sarah stepped out to find the doctor, Frank sat alone in the examination room, staring at the anatomical charts on the walls and trying to process what was happening. For 11 years, He told himself that the wound was healing, that it just needed more time, that his body would eventually figure out how to repair itself. Now, faced with Sarah's professional concern and the reality of what he'd allowed to happen, Frank felt the full weight of his denial settling over him like a heavy blanket. The wound on his leg throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat, a persistent reminder that some things couldn't be fixed with willpower and stubbornness alone. Sometimes Frank was beginning to understand. Asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the first step toward healing. Dr. Patricia Henley was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of direct manner that Frank associated with military medics. She examined his wound with professional thoroughness, asking questions that made Frank increasingly uncomfortable about his 11 years of self-treatment. "Have you experienced any numbness in your feet or hands?" Dr. Henley asked, gently probing the skin around the wound. "Sometimes my feet get a little tingly at night," Frank admitted reluctantly. "Excessive thirst? Frequent urination?" Frank shifted on the examination table. "Well, I'm not 20 anymore. These things happen when you get older." Dr. Henley and Sarah exchanged a look that Frank didn't like. Sarah was making notes on a chart, her pen moving steadily across the page in a way that reminded him of Martha, documenting important information in her careful handwriting. "Mr. Mallory," Dr. Henley said, setting down her instruments, "I'm going to order some blood work, but based on what I'm seeing here, I suspect we're dealing with more than just a slow-healing wound. This kind of chronic ulceration, especially given your other symptoms, suggests you may have undiagnosed diabetes." The word hit Frank like a physical blow. Diabetes meant weakness, dependence, a lifetime of needles and dietary restrictions and medical appointments. It meant admitting that his body had been failing him in ways he'd refused to acknowledge. "That's not possible," Frank said. "I feel fine most of the time." Diabetes is often called a silent disease for exactly that reason, Dr. Henley explained patiently. Many people live with it for years without recognizing the symptoms. The good news is that with proper management, you can live a completely normal life. After Dr. Henley left to arrange for the blood work, Sarah remained in the room, cleaning the wound with gentle efficiency. Her touch was careful and professional, but Frank could see the worry in her eyes. "You know," Sarah said as she applied a proper medical dressing. "Aunt Martha used to talk about you all the time. She was so proud of how you took care of everything, the farm, the house, all those mechanical projects you were always working on." Frank felt a familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of Martha's name. She was a good woman. Too good for an old fool like me. "She loved you, Uncle Frank, but she also worried about you." That evening, Frank sat in his kitchen with a folder of Martha's medical records that he'd found in her organized filing system. Sarah had suggested he gather any family medical history that might be relevant, and Martha's meticulous record-keeping had preserved nearly 40 years of medical documentation. As he flipped through the papers, Frank was struck by the sheer volume of medical care Martha had received throughout their marriage. Regular checkups, preventive screenings, follow-up appointments for minor concerns that Frank would have ignored completely. She'd had her blood pressure monitored, her cholesterol checked, her vision and hearing tested annually. During her final illness, a brief but aggressive cancer that had taken her in just 4 months, there were pages and pages of test results, treatment notes, and medication schedules. Frank had been present for all of it, sitting in waiting rooms and driving her to appointments, but he'd never really absorbed the implications of Martha's careful attention to her health. To him, it had seemed like an excessive preoccupation with problems that might never materialize. Now, holding the evidence of her systematic self-care, Frank began to understand that Martha hadn't been paranoid or hypochondriacal. She'd been wise. The contrast with his own approach to health was stark and embarrassing. The last time Frank had seen a doctor before today was in 1998. for a physical required by his employer's insurance company. Before that, he had to go back to his discharge physical from the Army in 1971. Nearly 30 years of willful medical neglect, justified by a combination of pride, stubbornness, and a fundamental belief that his body would continue functioning as long as he didn't ask too many questions. Martha's records included detailed notes about family medical history, her father's heart disease, her mother's stroke, her grandmother's diabetes. Frank realized with growing alarm that Martha had been tracking patterns and risk factors with the same methodical attention she brought to planning her garden. She'd understood that health, like agriculture, required careful cultivation and preventive care. The phone rang, interrupting his brooding review of Martha's papers. It was Sarah, calling to check on him after his first day of medical reality. "How are you feeling about everything?" she asked. Frank looked down at the stack of medical records, evidence of everything he'd been avoiding for decades. "Overwhelmed, I suppose. All these years, I thought I was being strong by handling things myself. Turns out, I was just being stupid." "You weren't being stupid, Uncle Frank. You were being scared. There's a difference." Sarah's gentle insight caught Frank off guard. He'd spent so much energy over the years framing his medical avoidance as a matter of pride and self-reliance that he'd never acknowledged the fear underneath. Fear of being vulnerable, of receiving bad news, of confronting his own mortality. In a clinical setting that reminded him too much of Martha's final months. "The blood work results should be back tomorrow," Sarah continued. "Dr. Henley wants to see you again on Friday to discuss the results and talk about a treatment plan." After he hung up the phone, Frank returned to Martha's medical records. But this time he wasn't just reviewing her careful documentation. He was looking for clues about his own neglected health. Had she noticed his symptoms before he did? Had she worried about his stubborn refusal to see doctors? Had she tried to bring up her concerns in ways that he'd dismissed or ignored? In the margins of some of her appointment notes, Frank found evidence that Martha had indeed been paying attention to his health. Next to a note about her own blood pressure medication, she'd written Frank's feet swelling. In the corner of a page about diabetes prevention, there was a small notation. F, always thirsty lately. Martha had been watching out for him even when he wouldn't watch out for himself. She'd been documenting signs and symptoms that he'd refused to acknowledge, maintaining a quiet vigil over his health while respecting his stubborn insistence on independence. The realization filled Frank with a mixture of gratitude and guilt that threatened to overwhelm him. He closed the folder and sat in the gathering darkness of his kitchen, listening to the familiar sounds of the old farmhouse settling around him. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the loose boards on the porch and sending dried leaves skittering across the yard. Winter was coming, and for the first time in his adult life, Frank wasn't sure he was prepared for it. The wound on his leg throbbed gently beneath its new professional dressing, a reminder that his body had been trying to tell him something important. For 11 long years. Tomorrow would bring test results and treatment plans and the beginning of a new relationship with his own mortality. Tonight, Frank sat with Martha's careful records and tried to forgive himself for taking so long to listen. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, with the promise of Iowa's first serious frost hanging in the air. Frank sat in Dr. Henley's office, his hands folded in his lap, waiting for news he was fairly certain he didn't want to hear. The blood work results lay in a manila folder on the doctor's desk, and Frank found himself staring at it as if he could divine its contents through sheer concentration. "Your blood sugar levels confirm what we suspected," Dr. Henley said without preamble. "You have type 2 diabetes, and based on your HbA1c levels, you've probably had it for several years. The good news is that it's entirely manageable with the right approach." Frank absorbed this information with the same stoic acceptance he'd once applied to receiving orders he didn't like in the Army. Diabetes wasn't a death sentence. But it was a life sentence, one that would require constant vigilance and medical supervision for whatever years he had left. What does that mean, exactly? Frank asked. Dr. Henley pulled out a pamphlet with cheerful graphics showing people exercising and eating colorful vegetables. It means we need to get your blood sugar under control, and that starts with medication, dietary changes, and regular monitoring. The wound on your leg isn't healing because high blood sugar impairs your body's ability to repair itself. Medication, Frank repeated. The word felt foreign and unwelcome in his mouth. A daily pill to start, nothing dramatic. We'll monitor your levels and adjust as needed. The bigger changes will be in what you eat and how often you check your blood sugar. Frank left the clinic with a bag full of medical supplies that felt like artifacts from an alien world. A blood glucose meter, testing strips, lancets for pricking his finger, and a month's supply of metformin tablets. Dr. Henley had scheduled him for a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks and given him the business card of a diabetes educator in town. That afternoon, Sarah appeared at his kitchen door carrying a wicker basket that Frank recognized immediately. Martha's recipe box, a wooden container decorated with hand-painted roses that had sat on the counter for 43 years, organizing the culinary wisdom that had kept Frank well-fed and content throughout their marriage. Mom thought you might like to have this back, Sarah said, setting the basket on the kitchen table. She's been keeping it safe since the funeral, but she figures it belongs here. Frank opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were hundreds of index cards covered in Martha's neat handwriting, recipes for pot roast and apple pie, instructions for canning green beans and making strawberry preserves, notes about Frank's favorite meals and the dishes she'd served to company. Each card was a small monument to Martha's care and attention, evidence of all the ways she'd nourished him over the decades. She loved to cook for you, Sarah said softly. Mom says Martha used to spend hours planning menus, making sure you got proper nutrition, even when you were too busy with the farm to pay attention to what you were eating. Frank pulled out a card for Martha's famous beef stew, complete with notes about substitutions and timing. In the margin, she'd written Frank's favorite on cold days in her careful script. Another card detailed her recipe for Sunday morning: pancakes, with a note that said, "Make extra, he always wants seconds." The thing is, Sarah continued, settling into the chair across from him, a lot of these recipes are going to need some adjusting now that we know about the diabetes. But that doesn't mean you have to give up all the foods you love. We just need to be smarter about how we prepare them. Sarah pulled out a notebook and began going through the recipe cards, making notes about modifications that would work with Frank's new dietary restrictions. She explained how they could reduce sodium in Martha's pot roast recipe, substitute whole grain flour in her bread recipes, and use natural sweeteners in place of sugar in her desserts. Aunt Martha was always adapting her recipes anyway, Sarah said. Remember how she started using low-fat milk when Uncle George was having heart problems? And she figured out how to make her famous cookies with less butter when her doctor told her to watch her cholesterol. She was good at finding ways to take care of people without making them feel deprived. Frank watched Sarah work through Martha's recipes with the same methodical care that Martha herself had brought to meal planning. It was comforting to see the recipes being treated with such respect, but also overwhelming to realize how much his life was about to change. "I don't know how to do any of this," Frank admitted. "Martha handled all the cooking, all the meal planning. I can make coffee and heat up leftovers, but that's about the extent of my culinary skills." "Then it's time to learn," Sarah said with a smile that reminded Frank powerfully of her aunt. "Aunt Martha would have loved teaching you to cook. She always said you were good with your hands machinery. Isn't that different from cooking? Both require following instructions, paying attention to details, and making adjustments when things don't go according to plan." Over the next hour, Sarah walked Frank through the basics of blood sugar monitoring, showing him how to use the glucose meter and explaining what the numbers meant. She demonstrated how to prepare a simple, diabetes-friendly meal using ingredients he already had in his kitchen, adapting one of Martha's simpler recipes to work with his new dietary requirements. The key is consistency, Sarah explained as she showed him how to measure portions. Your body needs to know what to expect. Regular meal times, balanced nutrition, and consistent medication timing will help keep your blood sugar stable. Frank found himself thinking about the parallels between managing diabetes and maintaining farm equipment. Both required regular attention, preventive care, and the wisdom to address small problems before they became major failures. It was a framework he could understand, even if the specifics felt foreign and intimidating. As Sarah prepared to leave, she paused at the kitchen door, looking back at Frank with an expression of gentle concern. "Uncle Frank, I know this feels overwhelming right now, but you're not in this alone. Aunt Martha spent 43 years taking care of you, and now it's time for the rest of us to step up. You've got family who cares about you, and we're not going anywhere." After Sarah left, Frank sat with Martha's recipe box open on the table before him, reading through her careful notations and imagining her voice guiding him through the preparations. Outside, the first frost of the season was settling over the farmhouse, turning the windows opaque with delicate ice crystals. Winter was coming, but for the first time in years, Frank didn't feel like he had to face it entirely alone. The first week of managing diabetes felt like learning a foreign language. Frank's kitchen counter became a landscape of pill bottles, testing supplies, and food scales that would have bewildered Martha, who had cooked by instinct and experience rather than precise measurements. Every morning, Frank pricked his finger and recorded numbers in a logbook that Dr. Henley had given him, trying to understand the relationship between what he ate, when he ate it, and the mysterious fluctuations in his blood sugar. Sarah had been true to her word about not leaving him to navigate this alone. She stopped by every few days, ostensibly to check on his wound care, but really to monitor his adjustment to the new routines. She'd found him one morning staring helplessly at the glucose meter, which was flashing an error message he couldn't interpret. "It's just telling you the test strip is expired," Sarah explained patiently, showing him how to check the dates on the packaging. "These things happen. Don't let the technology intimidate you." Frank had always prided himself on being mechanically inclined, able to diagnose problems with engines and electrical systems by sound and intuition. But medical equipment operated according to different principles, and he found himself frustrated by his inability to master what seemed like simple procedures. The dietary changes were proving even more challenging than the blood sugar monitoring. Frank had spent 68 years eating whatever appealed to him whenever he felt hungry. Now every meal required planning and consideration, portion control, and careful attention to carbohydrate content. Martha's recipe box had become both a comfort and a source of frustration, filled with dishes he could no longer prepare the way she'd intended. On a cold Thursday morning in November, Frank was in his workshop trying to organize Martha's gardening tools when Tom Henderson knocked on the door. Frank's neighbor carried a thermos of coffee and wore the expression of someone who'd been elected by committee to have a difficult conversation. "Betty sent me over," Tom said without preamble. "She's worried you're not eating properly since you started this diabetes business. Says you look thin when she saw you at the grocery store." Frank gestured to a pair of milk crates that served as makeshift chairs. Martha's garden tools hung on their designated hooks, exactly where she'd left them 3 years ago. The handles showed signs of weathering now, the wood gray and rough from exposure to changing seasons. Frank had been meaning to oil them, to restore them to the condition Martha would have expected, but somehow he could never quite bring himself to disturb their arrangement. "I'm eating fine," Frank said, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. He'd lost weight since starting the diabetes medications, partly because of improved blood sugar control, but mostly because cooking for one person felt like an exercise in futility. "You know, Martha's sewing kit is still sitting in the living room," Tom observed, changing the subject with the diplomatic skill of a man who'd been married for 45 years. "Betty noticed it when she dropped off that casserole last week." Frank had noticed it too, the wicker basket with its neat compartments for threads and needles, thimbles and buttons. Martha had been an accomplished seamstress, always mending something or working on quilts for church fundraisers. The sewing kit sat on the table beside her favorite chair, waiting for hands that would never return to complete the projects she'd left unfinished. "I keep meaning to put things away," Frank admitted. "But every time I start, it feels like I'm erasing her somehow." Tom nodded with the understanding of someone who'd thought about his own mortality enough to imagine his wife sorting through his belongings. "My grandfather's tools are still hanging in my workshop, 20 years after he died." Sometimes it's not about putting things away. It's about learning to live alongside the memories. They sat in comfortable silence, drinking Tom's coffee and listening to the wind rattle the workshop's windows. Outside, the last of the autumn leaves were clinging stubbornly to the oak trees that lined Frank's driveway, brown and brittle, but refusing to surrender to winter's approach. "Sarah seems like good people," Tom offered eventually. "She's got Martha's way of seeing straight through to what needs doing," Frank replied. "Doesn't let me get away with much nonsense. That's a blessing even when it doesn't feel like one." That afternoon, Frank found himself examining Martha's sewing kit more carefully than he had since her death. Inside, he discovered a collection of small notebooks where Martha had recorded her sewing projects, measurements for quilts, notes about fabric purchases, sketches of patterns she wanted to try. Her handwriting filled page after page with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized everything she touched. That mixed in with the sewing notes were other observations that made Frank's chest tighten with recognition. Frank rubbing his leg again during dinner. She'd written on one page, "Seems worse when weather changes." On another page, "F, getting up more often at night. Should mention to doctor if it continues." Martha had been documenting his symptoms for years, tracking patterns and changes with the same careful attention she brought to recording her garden's progress through each growing season. She'd been preparing to advocate for his health, compiling evidence that could have led to earlier diagnosis and treatment if Frank had been willing to listen. The notebooks revealed a side of Martha that Frank had never fully appreciated, not just the loving wife who wanted to take care of him, but the intelligent woman who understood that health problems rarely appeared overnight. She'd been watching and waiting, hoping he would eventually become concerned enough about his symptoms to seek medical attention on his own. Frank spent the rest of the day reading through Martha's careful observations, feeling a mixture of gratitude and regret that threatened to overwhelm him. She'd known about the diabetes before he'd been willing to acknowledge it. She'd recognized the signs and tried, in her gentle way, to guide him toward the care he needed. As evening approached, Frank carefully returned the notebooks to Martha's sewing kit, but this time he didn't feel like he was preserving a shrine to the past. Instead, he felt like he was honoring Martha's patient vigilance by finally taking the steps she'd hoped he would take years ago. The wound on his leg was beginning to show signs of improvement under proper medical care, and his blood sugar levels were slowly stabilizing with medication and dietary changes. Frank was beginning to understand that healing wasn't just about addressing immediate problems. It was about developing the kind of ongoing relationship with his own health that Martha had been modeling for decades. Winter was coming to the Iowa farmland, but Frank no longer felt like he was facing it entirely unprepared. The December snow came early that year, blanketing the farmhouse and surrounding fields in a pristine white that reminded Frank of the winters when he and Martha were young. He stood at the kitchen window, watching the flakes fall steadily past the glass and realized that for the first time in months, his leg wasn't throbbing with constant pain. The wound was finally beginning to heal under Dr. Henley's careful treatment, and his blood sugar levels had stabilized enough that he was starting to feel more like himself again. Sarah had been coming by twice a week, combining her professional check-ins with what she called family visits. This Tuesday afternoon, she brought Chinese takeout and was helping Frank sort through a stack of medical forms that had accumulated on his kitchen table. The complexity of managing diabetes had introduced a bewildering array of paperwork. Insurance claims, prescription records, appointment schedules, and dietary tracking sheets. "You know," Sarah said, reviewing his blood sugar log, "these numbers are looking really good. Dr. Henley is going to be pleased with your progress." Frank felt a small surge of pride at her approval, followed immediately by embarrassment at how much her opinion mattered to him. At 68 years old, he shouldn't need a 30-year-old nurse to validate his efforts at basic self-care. But somehow Sarah's encouragement had become an important part of his motivation to stay on track. With his treatment, "I've been thinking about something," Sarah continued, setting down the logbook. "When I was going through some of Mom's things last weekend, I found a box of Aunt Martha's belongings that she'd asked me to keep safe. There's something in there I think you should see." She disappeared to her car and returned with a small wooden box that Frank recognized as Martha's jewelry case. Inside, beneath her pearl necklace and the earrings he'd given her for their 20th anniversary, Sarah found what she was looking for: a purple heart medal wrapped in tissue paper, along with Frank's old Army discharge papers. Frank stared at the medal, feeling a familiar tightness in his chest. He hadn't seen it in years, hadn't even thought about where Martha might have stored it after they'd moved to the farmhouse. The bronze heart with its purple ribbon looked smaller than he remembered, less significant somehow than the weight it had carried in his memory. "Aunt Martha never talked much about your service," Sarah said gently. "But she told me once that you'd been awarded this for being wounded in action. She said you never liked to discuss it." Frank picked up the medal, feeling the cool metal against his palm. The wound that had earned him this recognition had healed completely within weeks, leaving only a small scar on his shoulder and a story he'd never been comfortable telling. Compared to what some of his fellow soldiers had endured, Frank had always felt that his injury was minor, almost embarrassing in its insignificance. "It wasn't much," Frank said. "Shrapnel from a mortar round. I was back on duty within a month." "But you could have died," Sarah pointed out. "And you let the medics treat you, didn't you? You didn't try to handle it yourself." Frank saw where she was heading with this observation, and he felt a familiar resistance rising in his chest. "That was different. That was war, was it? You trusted military doctors to take care of you when you were hurt. You followed their orders, took their medications, let them monitor your recovery. What's different about trusting civilian doctors to take care of you now?" Frank had no good answer for this question, and they both knew it. He'd been thinking about his military service more often since starting his diabetes treatment, remembering the camaraderie of soldiers who looked out for each other, who understood that individual strength meant knowing when to accept help from your unit. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling out Frank's discharge papers. "Did you know that diabetes is considered a service-connected disability for Vietnam veterans? Agent Orange exposure significantly increases the risk of developing type 2 diabetes later in life." Frank had heard rumors about Agent Orange over the years, stories about chemical exposure and delayed health effects that the government had been slow to acknowledge. But he'd never connected those stories to his own experience, never considered that his current health problems might be related to his military service. "The VA has programs specifically for veterans with diabetes," Sarah continued. "Better coverage for medications and supplies, specialized care coordinators, support groups with other veterans who are dealing with similar issues." Frank felt something shift inside him as he absorbed this information. For 11 years, he'd framed his wound and his diabetes as personal failures, evidence of his body's betrayal and his own stubborn neglect. The possibility that his condition might be connected to his military service recontextualized everything in a way that felt both liberating and overwhelming. "I served my country," Frank said slowly, more to himself than to Sarah. "I did my duty, followed orders, took care of my fellow soldiers. If this diabetes is connected to that service, then taking care of it isn't weakness. It's continuing to honor my obligation to the mission." Sarah smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd helped another person reach an important realization. "Aunt Martha would have loved hearing you say that." She always believed that taking care of yourself was a way of showing respect for the people who love you. That evening, after Sarah had gone home, Frank sat in his workshop holding the Purple Heart and thinking about the parallels between his military service and his current health challenges. In Vietnam, he'd learned that survival depended on teamwork, on trusting your unit and following the guidance of people with specialized knowledge. Medics, radio operators, experienced sergeants, everyone had a role to play in keeping the mission moving forward. Managing diabetes required the same kind of coordinated effort. Dr. Henley was his commanding officer. Sarah was his medic, and the diabetes educator was like a specialist consultant brought in to address specific tactical challenges. Frank's role was to follow orders, stay disciplined, and trust the expertise of people who knew more about this particular battlefield than he did. For the first time since his diagnosis, Frank felt like he had a framework for understanding his situation that didn't require him to see himself as weak or defeated. He was a soldier dealing with a service-connected injury, following a treatment protocol designed by medical professionals who understood the challenges he was facing. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the farmhouse and the surrounding fields in a blanket of white that promised both the quiet of winter and the eventual return of spring. 3 days before Christmas, Sarah arrived at Frank's farmhouse, carrying a cardboard box that looked like it had been stored in an attic for years. She found Frank in the kitchen, carefully measuring out his morning medication with the precision he'd once applied to calibrating machine tools. His blood sugar management had become routine over the past month, and the wound on his leg was healing so well that Dr. Henley had reduced his follow-up appointments to once a month. "I've been going through more of Aunt Martha's things," Sarah said, setting the box on the kitchen table. "Mom found this hidden behind some other boxes in her closet. It's got Martha's name on it, but it was sealed with tape, like she didn't want anyone to see what was inside." Frank looked at the box with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Martha had been a private person in some ways, keeping certain thoughts and feelings to herself even during 43 years of marriage. The idea that she'd hidden something important enough to warrant a sealed box made him nervous about what they might discover. Inside the box, beneath layers of tissue paper, Sarah found a leather-bound journal with medical notes written on the cover in Martha's careful handwriting. The journal was thick, its pages filled with entries dating back more than 15 years. As Sarah opened it and began reading, her expression shifted from curiosity to concern to something that looked like amazement. "Uncle Frank," Sarah said softly, "I think you need to see this." The journal was a comprehensive medical record that Martha had been keeping about Frank's health, documenting symptoms and patterns that she'd observed over years of careful attention. The earliest entries dated back to 2008, 2 years before Frank's tractor accident and the beginning of his chronic wound. March 15, 2008. Frank complained of his feet being numb when he got out of bed this morning. Said it felt like pins and needles, but it went away after he walked around for a few minutes. This is the 3rd time this month. April 2, 2008. Found Frank drinking water directly from the kitchen faucet at 2 a.m. When I asked, he said he was incredibly thirsty, but didn't want to wake me by getting a glass from the cabinet. He's been drinking much more water lately. May 20, 2008. Frank's hands are shaking slightly when he works on detailed projects. He thinks it's just age, but I'm starting to worry it might be something more serious. Page after page detailed Martha's observations about symptoms that Frank had either ignored or attributed to normal aging. She'd been tracking patterns with the methodical attention of a researcher, noting correlations between Frank's diet, his activity levels, and the severity of his symptoms. June 10, 2009. Scheduled an appointment for Frank with Dr. Patterson for July 15th. I'm going to tell him it's for a routine physical, but I need someone to look at his circulation problems and the constant thirst. He's lost weight, and he doesn't seem to notice how much his eating habits have changed. Frank felt his stomach drop as he read this entry. She made me an appointment? Sarah turned the page and found the answer to his question. July 12, 2009. Had to cancel Frank's appointment. Dr. Patterson's office called to confirm, and Frank overheard the conversation. He was furious that I'd scheduled something without asking him first. Said he felt fine and didn't need any doctor poking around looking for problems that didn't exist. I didn't want to fight about it, so I called and canceled. Maybe I should have insisted, but I was afraid of making him even more resistant to medical care. The journal entries continued chronologically, documenting Martha's growing concern and her increasingly sophisticated understanding of Frank's symptoms. She'd been researching diabetes, circulation problems, and the long-term effects of untreated metabolic disorders. Her notes included medical terminology that she'd obviously looked up, questions she wanted to ask doctors, and careful observations about which symptoms seemed to be getting worse. September 3, 2010. Frank cut his leg on the tractor today. It's not a deep cut, but I'm worried about how it will heal given all the other symptoms I've been tracking. His body doesn't seem to repair itself the way it used to. I tried to convince him to see a doctor about it, but he just cleaned it and wrapped it himself. He says it's nothing to worry about. Sarah's voice was quiet as she read this entry aloud. They both understood the significance of this date. It was when Frank's chronic wound had first appeared, and Martha had immediately recognized it as potentially serious. The journal entries from 2010 onward showed Martha's increasing frustration with Frank's refusal to seek medical care, balanced against her determination to continue monitoring his condition. She'd been tracking the wound's failure to heal, documenting its appearance and any changes in size or color. She'd researched diabetic ulcers and wound care, teaching herself about circulation problems and the relationship between blood sugar and healing. December 24, 2011. Frank's wound is getting worse, and he won't admit it. The skin around it looks angry and swollen. I've been reading about diabetic complications, and I'm terrified that this could become seriously infected. I made another appointment with Dr. Patterson for after the holidays, but I know Frank will cancel it if he finds out. January 3, 2012. Frank found out about the appointment and canceled it himself this time. He accused me of going behind his back and treating him like a child. We had our worst fight in 20 years. He said if I couldn't trust him to take care of himself, maybe I should find someone else to worry about. I know he didn't mean it, but it hurt. I don't know how to help someone who won't let himself be helped. Frank's hands were shaking as he read Martha's account of their argument. He remembered that fight, remembered the bitter words they'd exchanged, and the cold silence that had lasted for days afterward. At the time, he'd felt justified in his anger, convinced that Martha was overreacting to minor health issues. Now, reading her careful documentation of his symptoms, Frank understood that she'd been trying to save his life, while he'd been too proud and stubborn to let her. The final entries in the journal were the most difficult to read. Martha had continued documenting Frank's symptoms even as her own health began to decline. Her handwriting became less steady, her observations more urgent. as if she understood that her time to advocate for his health was running out. March 10, 2022. Diagnosis confirmed. Cancer, stage 3. Treatment starts next week. I'm terrified about leaving Frank alone with his health problems. The wound on his leg has never healed properly, and he still refuses to see a doctor about it. I've been documenting everything in case someone else needs to advocate for him after I'm gone. April 15th, 2022. Frank is so focused on taking care of me that he's neglecting himself even more than usual. His limp is getting worse, and I can see he's in pain, but he won't admit it because he doesn't want to add to my worries. I wish I could make him understand that the best way to take care of me is to take care of himself too. The last entry in the journal was dated just 2 weeks before Martha's death. I've hidden this journal where Sarah will eventually find it. If something happens to me, I hope she'll know what to do with the information I've collected. Frank has always been stubborn about his health, but he's not stupid. If the right person presents the evidence in the right way, maybe he'll finally accept the help he needs. I love him too much to watch him destroy himself through neglect. Sarah closed the journal carefully, and they sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, snow was falling again, adding to the accumulation that had been building all week. The kitchen felt warm and safe, but Frank's mind was reeling with the implications of what they'd just discovered. Martha had known. She'd known about his diabetes years before his diagnosis, had understood the significance of his wound from the very beginning, and had been systematically documenting evidence that could have led to early treatment if Frank had been willing to listen. More than that, she'd planned for this moment, hiding her research where Sarah would find it after Frank had finally been forced to confront his health problems. She was trying to save my life, Frank said quietly, and I kept fighting her every step of the way. Sarah reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. She was trying to save your life, she agreed, and in the end, she did. This journal is what convinced me to specialize in wound care when I was finishing nursing school. Aunt Martha's documentation taught me how to recognize the signs of diabetic complications, and that knowledge has helped me take better care of dozens of patients over the years. Frank looked down at Martha's journal, this final gift from the woman who had loved him enough to fight for his health, even when he wouldn't fight for it himself. The weight of her love and her foresight settled over him like a warm blanket, comforting and overwhelming at the same time. What am I supposed to do with this? Frank asked. Sarah smiled with an expression that reminded him powerfully of her aunt. You're supposed to honor it, she said simply. You're supposed to take care of yourself the way she always wanted you. And you're supposed to stop feeling guilty about taking so long to get here. Aunt Martha didn't document all of this to make you feel bad. She did it because she believed you were worth saving. Frank spent the week between Christmas and New Year's reading Martha's journal over and over, each pass revealing new layers of her love and concern that he'd been too stubborn to recognize while she was alive. Sarah had left her aunt's reading glasses on the kitchen table, wire-rimmed, spectacles with a slight magnification that Martha had used for close work during her final years. When Frank put them on to read the journal entries, it felt like seeing his life through Martha's eyes, understanding for the first time the patience and wisdom that had guided her. Careful observations. The glasses transformed Martha's handwriting from a familiar script into something more intimate and immediate. Through the slight magnification, Frank could see the subtle changes in her penmanship over the years, the way her letters became more deliberate as arthritis stiffened her fingers, the increased urgency in her notes as his symptoms worsened and her own health began to decline. January 15th, 2018. Frank's circulation is definitely getting worse. His feet are cold all the time now, even when he's wearing thick socks. He says it's just winter, but this is different from normal cold sensitivity. I've been reading about peripheral artery disease, and I'm worried that the diabetes I suspect he has is already causing complications. Frank remembered that winter, remembered complaining about cold feet, and Martha's suggestion that he see a doctor about circulation problems. He dismissed her concerns as the overcautiousness of someone who'd spent too much time worrying about health issues. Now, reading her careful research into peripheral artery disease, Frank understood that Martha had been trying to prevent exactly the kind of complications that had made his wound so difficult to heal. March 22, 2020. The pandemic has made everything more complicated. Frank is using the lockdown as an excuse to avoid any medical care at all. He says the virus makes it too dangerous to go to doctors' offices, but I think he's secretly relieved to have a reason to postpone dealing with his health problems. Meanwhile, his wound continues to not heal properly, and I'm running out of ways to encourage him to seek treatment without starting another fight. Frank set down the journal and looked around his kitchen, seeing it with new clarity. Martha's coffee cup still sat in the cabinet where he'd left it 3 years ago. Her reading glasses had been on the windowsill all this time, waiting for someone to use them to see clearly again. Her recipe box contained not just instructions for cooking, but evidence of her systematic approach to caring for the people she loved. The phone rang, interrupting his contemplation. It was Dr. Henley's office, calling to confirm his appointment for the following week and to remind him about some additional tests she wanted to run. Mr. Mallory? This is Jennifer from Dr. Henley's office. We have you scheduled for next Tuesday at 2 p.m., and the doctor wanted me to mention that she's planning to discuss some additional treatment options with you. What kind of additional treatment? Frank asked. She mentioned something about wound care specialists and possibly adjusting your medication regimen. She'll go over all the details when you come in, but she wanted you to know that she's very pleased with your progress so far. After he hung up the phone, Frank realized that he was no longer approaching his medical appointments with the dread and resistance that had characterized his attitude toward healthcare for decades. Martha's journal had fundamentally changed his understanding of what it meant to take care of himself. He wasn't surrendering to weakness. He was honoring Martha's love and completing the mission she'd started years ago. That afternoon, Frank called Sarah and asked her to come over. When she arrived, she found him sitting at the kitchen table with Martha's journal open in front of him, along with a legal pad where he'd been making notes. "I've been thinking about what you said," Frank began, "about honoring Martha's work by taking better care of myself. I want to do this right, but I need help understanding what that means." Sarah sat down across from him, and Frank showed her the list he'd been making. It included every medical concern that Martha had documented, organized chronologically and cross-referenced with his current symptoms. He'd been trying to create a comprehensive picture of his health history that could guide future treatment decisions. "This is exactly what Aunt Martha would have wanted," Sarah said, reviewing his notes. She believed that informed patients make better decisions about their care. "But Frank, you don't have to carry all of this responsibility alone. That's what medical teams are for. I know that now," Frank said. "But I also know that I need to be an active participant in my own care, not just someone who shows up for appointments and follows orders without understanding what's happening." Sarah helped Frank organize his notes into a format that would be useful for Dr. Henley, creating a timeline of symptoms and documenting the progression of his wound over the 11 years since it had first appeared. They also made a list of questions Frank wanted to ask about his long-term prognosis and the potential for preventing additional complications. "There's something else I want to do," Frank said, pulling out a fresh piece of paper. "I want to write a letter to Martha. I know she can't read it, but I need to say some things that I should have said while she was alive." Sarah nodded with understanding. "I think that's a beautiful idea." Aunt Martha always believed that important things should be written down. Frank spent the next hour composing a letter to his late wife, using Martha's reading glasses to write as carefully as she had always written in her journals and recipe cards. The letter was an apology, a thank you note, and a promise all rolled into one. "Dear Martha," he began, "I've been reading your medical journal, and I finally understand what you were trying to do all those years. I'm sorry I was too proud and stubborn to listen when you were trying to help me. I'm sorry I made you worry about my health on top of everything else you were dealing with. Most of all, I'm sorry I waited until after you were gone to start taking care of myself the way you always wanted me to." He wrote about his diabetes diagnosis, about learning to monitor his blood sugar and adjust his diet, about the way his wound was finally healing under proper medical care. He told her about Sarah's help and Dr. Henley's treatment plan, about the VA benefits he was applying for and the support groups he was considering joining. "I'm not doing this because I feel guilty," Frank wrote, "though I do feel guilty about taking so long to get here. I'm doing this because I finally understand that taking care of myself is a way of honoring your love and continuing the conversation we started 43 years ago when we promised to take care of each other in sickness and in health." As Frank finished the letter, he felt something shift inside him, a sense of resolution that had been missing since Martha's death. For 3 years, he'd been stuck in a kind of emotional limbo, unable to move forward with his life because he'd never properly acknowledged the ways he'd failed to live up to her care and concern. The letter didn't erase his regrets, but it transformed them into motivation for doing better. "I want to show this to Dr. Henley," Frank said, handing the letter to Sarah. "Not because I need her medical opinion about my feelings, but because I want her to understand that I'm committed to this treatment for the long haul. I want her to know that I finally understand what Martha was trying to teach me about taking care of myself." Sarah read the letter with tears in her eyes, recognizing in Frank's words the same combination of love and determination that had characterized her. "Aunt's approach to caring for others. She would be so proud of you," Sarah said softly. "Aunt, Martha always believed that the most important conversations happen when we're ready to really listen. You're ready now, Uncle Frank. You're finally ready to hear what she was trying to tell you." Frank looked around his kitchen, seeing Martha's presence in every carefully preserved detail, but for the first time since her death, he didn't feel like he was living in a shrine to the past. Instead, he felt like he was carrying forward the best parts of their life together: her wisdom, her care, and her absolute conviction that the people we love are worth fighting for, even when they're too stubborn to fight for themselves. Next morning would bring his appointment with Dr. Henley and the beginning of a new phase in his treatment. But tonight, Frank felt prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with Martha's love and his own hard-won understanding of what it meant to truly take care of himself. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of January weather that made Frank grateful for the warm kitchen and the steady routine of his morning medication. As he prepared for his appointment with Dr. Henley, Frank found himself handling the small white appointment card that Martha had written out for him 13 years ago, the appointment he'd canceled in anger, convinced that she was treating him like a child who couldn't manage his own affairs. The card was yellowed now. Martha's handwriting faded but still legible. Frank Mallory, July 15th, 2009, 2 p.m., Dr. Patterson. She'd written it in her careful script, probably hoping that seeing his name in her handwriting would make the appointment feel less threatening, more like a collaboration than an ultimatum. Frank slipped the card into his shirt pocket, next to the letter he'd written to Martha and the organized notes Sarah had helped him prepare. These documents felt like armor, not protection against bad news, but preparation for facing whatever came next with the kind of informed courage that Martha had always demonstrated during her own medical challenges. Sarah arrived early to drive him to the clinic, bringing coffee in a thermos that had belonged to Martha and a folder containing copies of all the relevant pages from Martha's medical journal. They decided that Dr. Henley should see Martha's documentation, not as evidence of Frank's past negligence, but as valuable medical history that could inform his ongoing treatment. "How are you feeling about today? How are you feeling about today?" Sarah asked as they drove. Through the quiet streets of town, Frank considered the question seriously. "Nervous," he admitted. "But not the same kind of nervous I used to feel about doctors. This feels more like the nervousness I had before important missions in Vietnam. The kind where you know something significant is about to happen, but you trust your training and your team to get you through it." At the clinic, Dr. Henley reviewed Frank's recent test results with the satisfaction of a physician whose patient had exceeded expectations. His blood sugar levels had stabilized within normal ranges. His wound was healing steadily, and his overall health markers showed significant improvement over the past 2 months. "Your progress has been remarkable," Dr. Henley said, examining the healing wound on Frank's leg. "The tissue looks healthy. There's no sign of infection, and the circulation in your lower extremities has improved dramatically since we got your diabetes under control." Frank felt a surge of pride that surprised him with its intensity. For most of his adult life, he derived satisfaction from fixing machines and completing projects, from tangible accomplishments that he could see and measure. Now he was discovering a different kind of satisfaction in the successful management of his own health, in the small daily victories of proper medication timing and blood sugar monitoring. "There is one more thing I'd like to discuss," Dr. Henley continued. "Based on your excellent response to treatment, I think you might be a good candidate for some additional interventions that could further improve your long-term prognosis." She explained that Frank's dramatic improvement had opened up possibilities for more aggressive preventive care, specialized foot care to prevent future ulcers, enhanced cardiovascular monitoring to address his circulation issues, and participation in a diabetes management program specifically designed for veterans. "The VA has approved your service-connected disability claim," Dr. Henley said, reviewing a letter that had arrived at the clinic that morning. "Your diabetes has been officially recognized as related to Agent Orange exposure, which means you'll have access to enhanced benefits and specialized care coordination." Frank absorbed this information with the same careful attention he'd once applied to understanding complex mechanical systems. The VA benefits weren't just about financial assistance. They represented official recognition that his health problems were connected to his military service, not personal failings or character weaknesses. "I want to show you something," Frank said, pulling Martha's appointment card from his pocket. He explained the card's significance, how Martha had tried to get him medical care years before his diagnosis, and how his stubborn refusal to accept help had delayed treatment that could have prevented many of his complications. Dr. Henley examined the appointment card with the reverence of someone who understood the weight of missed opportunities and second chances. "Your wife was a remarkable woman," she said softly. "She was trying to advocate for your health in exactly the way that good healthcare partnerships are supposed to work." Frank also shared selected pages from Martha's medical journal, explaining how her careful documentation had helped him understand the progression of his symptoms and the importance of taking an active role in his ongoing care. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Henley said, reviewing Martha's notes about Frank's circulation problems and wound healing issues. Her observations were medically sophisticated and remarkably accurate. "With this kind of documentation, we can develop a much more comprehensive approach to preventing future complications." As the appointment concluded, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in a medical setting before: genuine partnership. Dr. Henley wasn't just treating his symptoms. She was working with him to honor Martha's legacy of careful attention to health and prevention. The appointment card in his pocket felt like a bridge between past regrets and future possibilities, a tangible reminder that it's never too late to start taking better care of yourself. The drive home from the clinic felt different than any medical appointment Frank had ever experienced. Instead of the relief of escaping unwanted scrutiny, He felt the satisfaction of a mission accomplished and a partnership established. In his jacket pocket, he carried a new bandage, not the makeshift wrapping he'd applied for 11 years, but a proper medical dressing that Dr. Henley had shown him how to change correctly. The bandage represented more than just wound care. It was a symbol of his commitment to treating his body with the same respect and attention he'd always given to his machinery. Clean, properly applied, and changed according to a schedule rather than when it became inconvenient. This was what responsible self-care looked like. Sarah pulled into the driveway of the farmhouse and sat for a moment before turning off the engine. "How do you feel about everything Dr. Henley said today?" Frank considered the question carefully. The enhanced treatment plan would require more frequent monitoring, additional medications, and lifestyle changes that would affect every aspect of his daily routine. 6 months ago, he would have seen these requirements as burdensome restrictions on his independence. Now, he understood them as tools for maintaining the kind of health that would allow him to remain independent for years to come. "I feel like I finally understand what Martha was trying to tell me," Frank said. "Taking care of myself isn't giving up control. It's taking responsibility for my own future." Inside the farmhouse, Frank went directly to the kitchen table where Martha's journal still lay open to the page he'd been reading that morning. Her final entry included a line that had stayed with him throughout his appointment. "I hope Frank will eventually understand that accepting help is not the same as accepting defeat." He picked up the pen he'd used to write his letter to Martha and added his own entry to her journal. January 15th, 2025. Saw Dr. Henley today. Wound is healing well. Diabetes is under control, and VA benefits approved. Martha, I finally heard what you were trying to tell me. Taking care of myself is a way of honoring your love and continuing our conversation about what it means to build a life together. Frank paused, then added, I'm not doing this because I feel guilty anymore. I'm doing this because I finally understand that the people we love deserve to have us stick around as long as possible, in the best health we can manage. You spent 43 years taking care of me. Now it's my turn to take care of the life we built together. Sarah found him in the kitchen, writing in Martha's journal with the careful attention his wife had always brought to documenting important information. Are you adding to Aunt Martha's medical notes? I thought she should know how the story turned out, Frank said. She started this documentation to help me get the care I needed. Now that I'm finally getting that care, it seems right to complete the record. Sarah sat down beside him and read what he'd written. She would be so proud of you, Uncle Frank. Aunt Martha always believed that love is about wanting the best possible future for the people who matter to you. By taking care of your health, you're living out her love in a very real way. Frank closed the journal and looked around his kitchen, seeing it with new eyes. Martha's coffee cup could stay in the cabinet, not as a shrine to grief, but as a reminder of shared mornings and the kind of companionship that made life worth protecting. Her reading glasses could remain on the windowsill, ready to help him see clearly when he needed to understand something important. Her recipe box could continue to guide his meal planning, adapted now for his diabetic diet, but still rooted in her wisdom about nourishing the people you love. I want to do something, Frank said suddenly. I want to reconnect with people I've been avoiding since Martha died. Tom and Betty Henderson, Martha's family, some of the guys from my old unit, who've been trying to stay in touch. I've been isolating myself because I thought that's what grief required. But I think Martha would want me to rebuild those connections. Sarah smiled with an expression that reminded Frank powerfully of her aunt. I think that's exactly what she would want. Aunt Martha always said that taking care of yourself includes taking care of your relationships with other people. That evening, Frank sat in his workshop, properly bandaging his healing wound according to Dr. Henley's instructions. The process had become a kind of meditation, a daily reminder of his commitment to the careful attention that Martha had always demonstrated in her own self-care. Outside, the January wind rattled the windows, but the workshop felt warm and purposeful. Frank's tools hung in their designated places, maintained and ready for use. Martha's garden tools waited in their corner, preserved but no longer neglected. Soon, Frank thought, it would be time to oil those handles and prepare them for another growing season. For the first time since Martha's death, Frank was beginning to look forward to spring not as an escape from the isolation of winter, but as an opportunity to nurture new growth in the garden she had loved and in the life they had built together. 3 months later, on a warm April morning that smelled of rich earth and new possibilities, Frank stood in what had once been Martha's garden holding a brand new spade. The tool felt solid and purposeful in his hands, its wooden handle smooth and unmarked, its metal blade sharp enough to slice cleanly through the Iowa soil that was finally soft enough for planting. The wound on his leg had healed completely, leaving only a thin scar that Dr. Henley had declared cosmetically insignificant, but medically remarkable. Frank's blood sugar levels had remained stable for 3 consecutive months, and he'd lost 20 pounds through careful diet management and the daily walks that had become as routine as his morning medication. More importantly, he'd gained something that had been missing from his life for far longer than he'd realized. A sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. Sarah arrived just as Frank was laying out the garden plot according to the detailed plans he'd found in Martha's gardening journals. She brought coffee in Martha's thermos and a box of seedlings from the greenhouse in town: tomatoes and peppers, green beans and summer squash, all the vegetables that Martha had grown with such care during their years together. "The soil looks perfect," Sarah observed, kneeling to examine the dark earth that Frank had been preparing for weeks. "Aunt Martha would be amazed to see how well you've restored this garden." Frank had spent the winter months studying Martha's gardening notes with the same methodical attention he'd once applied to understanding machine specifications. He'd learned about soil pH and companion planting, about pest management and succession, planting techniques that would provide fresh vegetables throughout the growing season. The knowledge felt like a continuation of conversations he and Martha had never quite finished, a way of learning from her expertise, even though she was no longer there to guide him directly. She always said that gardens require patience and faith, Frank said, using the new spade to create perfectly straight furrows for the bean seeds. You plant something small and trust that it will grow into something nourishing. The metaphor wasn't lost on either of them. Frank's commitment to his health had started as small daily actions, taking medications on schedule, checking his blood sugar, preparing proper meals, but had grown into a comprehensive transformation that affected every aspect of his life. He joined a diabetes support group at the VA hospital, where he'd connected with other veterans who understood the challenge of accepting help after decades of self-reliance. He'd reconnected with Tom and Betty Henderson, allowing them to include him in the social rhythms of rural community life. Most significantly, he'd begun reaching out to Martha's extended family, rebuilding relationships that had lapsed during his 3 years of grief-induced isolation. "I got a call from Dr. Henley yesterday," Frank said as he planted the first row of tomatoes. "She wants me to speak at a conference about chronic wound management. Apparently, my case is being used as an example of how family documentation can improve patient outcomes." Sarah looked up from the pepper seedlings she was transplanting. "Are you going to do it?" Frank considered the question while carefully spacing the tomato plants according to Martha's precise notations. 6 months ago, he would have dismissed such a request as an invasion of privacy, an unwelcome spotlight on personal failures he preferred to keep hidden. Now he understood that sharing his story might help other people avoid the years of denial and neglect that had nearly cost him his leg, and possibly his life. "I think Martha would want me to do it," Frank said. "She spent years documenting information that could help people understand the importance of early intervention. If her research can help other families recognize symptoms and seek treatment sooner, then sharing our story honors the work she did. As they worked together in the warming spring air, Frank felt the profound satisfaction of participating in the seasonal cycle that had defined rural life for generations. The garden would require daily attention throughout the growing season, watering and weeding, monitoring for pests and diseases, harvesting vegetables at their peak ripeness. These tasks weren't burdens, but opportunities to practice the kind of consistent, preventive care that Frank was learning to apply to his own health. The farmhouse looked different now, too. Frank had been gradually updating and maintaining systems that he'd neglected during his years of grief and medical denial. The loose porch boards were finally secure, the storm windows had been properly installed, and Martha's belongings were integrated into the house as functional reminders of shared life rather than preserved shrines to the past. Sarah's regular visits had evolved from medical check-ins to genuine family time. She often brought her children, now Martha's great-nieces and great-nephews, who were learning to associate the farmhouse with warmth and welcome rather than the sadness that had defined Frank's isolation. The sound of children's laughter in the rooms where he and Martha had lived quietly together felt like a blessing, a reminder that love creates legacy through the connections we maintain with the people who matter most. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Frank and Sarah finished planting the garden and stood back to admire their work. The neat rows of seedlings looked small and vulnerable in the broad expanse of prepared soil, but Frank could envision the abundant growth that would transform this patch of earth over the coming months. "You know," Frank said, wiping soil from his hands with the satisfaction of someone who'd completed meaningful work, "I used to think that taking care of things meant fixing them when they broke. Now I understand that real care means paying attention before problems develop, making small adjustments to prevent big failures." Sarah smiled with the recognition of wisdom earned through experience rather than inherited through instruction. Aunt Martha always said that love is a daily practice, not a one-time declaration. I think she'd be proud to see you practicing love on yourself with the same consistency you're bringing to this garden. Frank looked out over the farmland that stretched toward the horizon, where the late afternoon sun was painting the Iowa sky in shades of gold and pink. Tomorrow would bring another day of small, careful actions: morning medication, blood sugar monitoring, gentle exercise, proper nutrition, and the gradual tending of a garden that would feed him throughout the summer months. For the first time in years, Frank was looking forward to tomorrow, and to all the tomorrows that careful attention to his health might make possible. Martha's love lived on, not in the preservation of the past, but in his commitment to building a future worthy of the life they had shared together.